Hey everybody, it's EJ from Eyedesyn.com, and today we are going to be learning how to position objects along a surface of an object, conform splines to an object surface, or have an object deform along the surface of another object. So a lot of fun stuff we're going to be covering. We're going to even decorate a sugar skull. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's dive right in. Alright, so we're going to get to decorating our little sugar skull here. We're going to put some little cutesy flowers and hearts and all this kind of stuff on them. And basically what I'm going to be demonstrating is 3 different ways that we can align these objects along the surface of this skull. And not only just objects, but how to conform splines to a shape like this little eyebrow, as well as how to actually conform and bend an object along a surface like this little cross. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you how we can constrain this flower and this heart element to the surface. So typically, if you wanted to put this flower on this guy, you would have to physically, or manually put this in and hope it works okay. And that's just a real pain in the buttocks. So what we're going to do is a way better and way easier route, and that is using the constraint tag. So I'm going to right click, and this is my little flower null that has everything in it, all the flower petals, all the other stuff. And the one thing I want to keep in mind is when I'm setting this up is where that axis center is, because where I'm going to clamp this onto is gonna, and where it's gonna rotate, the center of rotation is all dependent on the axis center. So we want to make sure it's in the center and not like off to the side or anything like that, because then our rotation, when we actually clamp this onto the surface, will look correctly. So let's go ahead and get a constraint tag. And the function that we want to use in the constraint tag is this clamp function. And I'm going to click on clamp, and then that's going to enable our clamp options. And we're going to go over all these little options here, but the first thing we need to set up is the actual object we want to clamp this flower onto, and that is our skull. So how my skull is built is we have the subdivision surface, we have a symmetry object, as you can see, and then we have our low poly mesh here. And the main thing I want to cover is that we don't want to use this base low poly skull mesh as the target. We actually want to use the smoothed out subdivision surface version of this object for the clamp. So we actually recognize that smoothed out surface versus the low poly one. So we're going to drag the skull subdivision surface as the target, and you're going to see that nothing really happens aside from our distance changes. And as I move that, you can see that our object kind of just went away. And if I turn off the symmetry, you can see that our flower's inside our head. What the heck? So by default, what's going on with why our flower just popped into where our brain area is because this is set by default to the origin of our object. And you can see the origin is basically just the anchor point, or the axis center of our object, or our skull subdivision surface. So we actually want to use a different method of what to clamp onto. And if we go to the drop down, we can see that we have this surface. So we want to have this flower constrained to the surface so it can glide along the surface of this skull, so we can actually position it correctly. And if you see now, we actually have our flower in our eyeball, in our eye socket, and that's not good. But now if I move this out, you can see that as I'm moving this, I'm kind of just moving this all willy-nilly like, and you can see that this is clamped to the surface of our skull, the subdivision surface. So I'm moving this around. You can see this is a lot easier than trying to manually place this, but we actually have to first kind of adjust a few options here. You can see that this is not aligned correctly at all. This is aligned along the wrong axis. So what we need to do is go a little bit deeper in the options here. And the first thing I want to go over is this as. So what we want to do, it's really not taking into account the surface or the angle or the Phong angles of our geometry. unless we actually turn that on. in the constraint tag. So if we choose something like the Fong normal, it's going to then recognize the curved surface, and now you can see that our flower is kind of bending and rotating along that surface. It's recognizing the curvature of our object now as well. But we still have a problem, and that problem is that our alignment is not set up correctly. We don't want this to align in the y-axis. We actually want to align this in the z-axis because that's where our anchor point's kind of pointing. And if I just turn that to positive z, that's actually the wrong way. So let's go to negative z and then just move this and that'll update. Sometimes the constraint tag can be kind of laggy, especially when using subdivision surface and generator objects and all that kind of stuff. And the reason for that is because we actually need to go into our basic tab here and we can up the priority here. So right now, using this base priority, things can get kind of glitchy. Sometimes this can get moved and knocked out of place. So what we want to do is kind of prevent that. And since we're using generators, we want to make sure that we have generators set as the priority, and then we just want to crank this number up. Usually 100 and something is pretty safe to do. And basically what we're saying is we want the generators in this scene to do its thing and then calculate this constraint tag. And the reason for that is everything that's green, that has a green icon here, so the subdivision surface or the symmetry object here, those things are generators. And they need to calculate and kind of calculate the surface. So number one, smoothing out that skull and then creating that symmetry on the other side before we actually activate this clamp functionality. So that kind of just saves us some headaches and stuff like that. So once we put this flower in the right position, we can then we can save ourselves from ourselves by preventing us from accidentally moving that by going into the clamp options and saying lock position. And now we can no longer move it. It's locked. And so we're all good to go. So now we can actually do the same thing with the heart. And this has the subdivision surface as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get our constraint tag. Boop. Turn on clamp. Again, we want to make sure our priority is set to generators. And just crank that up. And let's go ahead to our clamp options. We want this to go along the surface. We want this in the negative Z as well, I believe. And we're going to use that Fong normal again. And now if we move up, forgot something. We need a target. What a ding dong. So let's go ahead and get our skull subdivision surface in there. Now, there we go. And the one thing you're going to notice, and this is kind of helpful, depending on how thick your object is we have this distance here. So as I move this heart into place, you can see that we got some intersecting going, and that actually doesn't look all that bad. But say you wanted to adjust this, and actually let's do the positive Z. There we go. Let's say we're going in the wrong direction here, so let's do negative Z again. Let's adjust this distance. And there we go. We actually move this. Let's rotate that. So now we got our heart again, and we can move this forward. So I think what happened was we just needed to reset, and again, the constraint tag is kind of finicky, and a lot of that has to do with the generators and the priority and all that stuff. And technically, everything is calculated in our object manager from top to bottom. So technically we should actually have both the flower and the subdivision surface actually at the bottom of our list and actually happening after and be below in the priority order of our skull and all that stuff. But the nice thing is we have this, let's go back to the heart. There we go. We can then offset this and have the distance change, and you can see that's kind of moving it out in Z space. And that just gives us a little bit of pad so we don't have any intersecting going on or anything like that. So that's looking good. We can move this heart into place. That's looking good. Another thing is typically a good workflow is having this all in a null. And just to kind of demonstrate, let's just pretend our subdivision surface is a null, and we have that clamped. So if we wanted to manually kind of move this forward or kind of rotate it a certain way, we can have the freedom to do that independently of our clamped axis of our subdivision surface. So that's just another workflow kind of handy tip, that you can just have the null, like group everything in a null, so then you have the freedom to move this and tweak it a little bit more if you need to, without adjusting the axis center on your clamped object. So we got that in the position we want, so we're going to turn on lock position so we don't mess with it anymore. There we go. You're going to see that you can move it a little bit, and that's just kind of constrained to the distance, but we have distance 0. We can't really move it. So there's that. So now I want to go over, so that's using the constraint tag to clamp things and position things along the surface. So think of, like, if you had a tree or something that you wanted to position on a landscape or something like that. This is really handy for that. The next thing I want to go over is how you can actually conform a spline to a shape. So we're going to try to recreate this little eyebrow element here. So there's our eyebrow spline. And for this, we're going to use a projection technique. And how you set up projection is, let's just go ahead and first let's change our color of this to something way obnoxious so we can actually see it in our scene. There we go. And so we can see it on over our white skull. And basically we just want to move this into position. So let's just let's first turn off this little element here. So there's our eye accents. We're going to turn off that eyebrow, and we kind of just want to, you can see how we have it just floating above our object here. And let's actually turn off the skull. So I'm just going to put X in that selection, just negate that for a while, and then when we're done, we can just zero out that X. So we just turned off that material, and basically we want to just set this up like this. We want this view to look like, yeah, we want this. If we were going to just have this be like a dynamic object and wrap along this from this camera view, that would actually happen correctly. So we're going to go and actually they have a function in Cinema 4D that allows you to do just that, where it's almost like a dynamic, like spline dynamics. We'll just let this flop and conform and just be conform to the shape of the object underneath it using this view. And we're going to go to Mesh and Spline, and we're going to project this spline onto the surface of the object underneath. And this works for this instance because we don't have any other objects other than that skull. If there was multiple objects, it would be projected on that as well, because our mode is our current view. And we can have different modes here. We can have just certain axes that we can use. But I just want to use this camera view we're in right now. I'm going to hit apply. And from this view, you're actually not going to see anything, but if I kind of rotate around, you can see that it's almost like we just plastered that from this camera view and just projected it onto the surface of our skull, which is really cool. So then what we can do is just use a sweep, and I'm just going to delete that spline that's currently there, and we'll turn this on. So we're going to use a sweep object, and you can see that with the circle as the sweep profile, we just swept a sphere or a circle along our object here, and we just created this cool little eyebrow element that is now an accent piece for our little skull. Our spline conformed to the shape of our skull, and that's pretty handy. So the final thing I want to do is show you how to actually have an object bend or conform to the surface of an object. So just like we did with the spline, but with an actual piece of geometry here. So this is going to be different from the heart and the flower because we're just using this to position this object or these objects along the surface, but it's not actually bending or conforming to the profile or the surface of the object. So let's just go in to a different composition here. So there's my little cross element, and the key here is that we have this. This is a extrude object. We have a bunch of subdivisions in here due to turning on the regular grid on this, and we can kind of get enough small subdivisions here set to quadrangles. We also have a lot of intermediate points using the natural versus the adaptive subdivision here. So we got a whole bunch of points, making our geometry a little bit of a denser mesh. So we have way more to geometry. So when this actually does conform to the spherical surface, it's going to look nice and smooth. So what we're going to use for this is a deformer. And we have this aptly named Surface Deformer here. So to be able to get our Surface Deformer to work with this extrude object, we can't just apply this as a child of any of these because we actually need this to be a group. But I like to keep things editable, so I don't want to make that editable. So what we can do instead is, instead of making the Surface Deformer a child of an object, if we just place both objects under a null and have them in the same hierarchy here, this deformer will then affect this cross, or this extrude object there. So this is our cross group. And just like with the constraint tag, on our surface deformer, we need to define a surface. And that's going to be our sphere here. And right now, if I hit initialize, it's set to projection, nothing's going to happen. And typically, I never use projection. Usually it's just mapping, and these mapping methods use the UVs of another object. And you're going to see that right away, we got some really funky stuff happening. But once we go to UV mapping, we can adjust the position of U and V. We can also adjust the scale. And if I adjust the scale enough, you can kind of see, you can kind of make out it's almost like our cross got rotated and squashed vertically. So what that means is that we need to then go ahead and adjust the axis rotation to get this lined up correctly. So right now it's like laying flat. We need to adjust this so it's standing upward. So I just went to axis center mode, adjust the axis rotation so it's now standing upwards, and you can see that fixed our cross. So now it's flat, but at least it's laying in the right direction and not being squashed vertically. So now we can go back into our options here and adjust the scale and kind of get that form, or get that cross looking the way it should. This also has an offset option, just like our constraint tag here. And you can see we have a few little gaps in here, and that's because we need to go into our cross and say create single object, and that'll then bind the caps and the rounding and make it act as one single piece of geometry, and that will get rid of our little gaps there versus the caps being treated as a entirely separate object. So you can see the point I was trying to make with having enough subdivisions so that our deformation, our surface deformation was smooth. But the problem here is, you can see it's still chunky, but the problem isn't with our cross object. Our problem actually is with the main object, the surface that we're using, the sphere. It just doesn't have as many segments as it should be to make this object smooth. You can see this is very low poly. You can see the bends are happening right at each polygon edge. So to just smooth everything out, we simply just need to crank up the segments here. And you can see now with that happening, we now have a nice smooth object here. being deformed or conformed along the surface of our sphere. So that's very handy. And again, if we didn't have enough geometry here, as I'm like cranking up the values, you can start to see that we have some Fung issues and some issues here as well. So it's very important that if we just go back to n-gons again, that we have this set up correctly and have enough subdivisions. All right, so we are done decorating our little sugar skull. We learned a few techniques on how to actually position objects along the skull surface or any object surface. One being the constraint tag set to clamp mode to be able to move objects along the surface of objects. Then we learned how to use the spline projection method to actually have a spline project onto the surface of an object and conform to the surface of the object. And then we learned how to use the Surface Deformer to do that same thing and deform objects and deform it to the surface of another object using the Surface Deformer. So that equips you with a lot of ways to be able to put objects on top of other object surfaces and create some fun stuff. So if you make anything fun using these techniques, be sure to tweet them at me, send them to me. I'd love to see what you're doing. And if you have any questions, be sure to throw them in the comment section. Thanks again for watching. And remember, if you liked this tutorial, be sure to like it. Smash that like button. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with all the latest Cinema 4D training and tutorials that I pump out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye, everybody.